He originally was scheduled to fight Mike Tyson, obviously, and they did the whole thing on Netflix. They made like a big deal about it, and everybody was kind of scratching their heads a little bit when that was announced. I think it just is a little out of left field, I would say. But you know what? It's Mike Tyson, so who's gonna tell him not to do the thing that he's made a legacy from, his entire life? So Jake Paul, obviously he's not known for being a boxer. Him taking this fight with Mike Perry kind of gave me a new respect for Jake Paul. So Mike Perry, yeah, he's a little bit smaller, he's a little bit shorter, but he's not a small guy. When he fought Luke Rockhold, and Luke Rockhold fought at 205, and Mike Perry's 5-0 in bare knuckle boxing. He's 0-1 in professional boxing. He had like one boxing fight years ago. I think it was almost 10 years ago. I do know that it's going to be 8 rounds. So that actually, I think, favors Jake Paul, because we saw him go 10 rounds with Nate Diaz. And I'm not saying that Mike Perry doesn't have a gas tank, because I definitely think Mike Perry does have a gas tank. However, I think that Jake Paul is a little bit more technical, I guess you could say. Mike Perry's a little bit more of a brawler, but he's probably the best brawler. So it's like, I don't think that's a bad thing to be a brawler. I think it works for some people. I think it works extremely well for Mike Perry. I'm just kind of pointing out some differences between the two, because I do still think Mike Perry is going to win this fight, because Mike Perry is a savage. I think he's one of the scariest fighters in all of combat sports, and I think he's only gotten better. I think he's in his prime right now. So Jake Paul, yeah, I would say he's probably the better boxer, but I think Mike Perry, well, he's got more experience fighting in general. Like, he's not afraid of anything, and when you have somebody in there like that, like, that's hard. That's a hard person to beat. And Nate Diaz is like that too, but Mike Perry is a much better boxer than Nate Diaz. So, and if you look at how Jake Paul performed against Nate Diaz, it's like, he definitely won the fight, but Nate Diaz had some moments. Let me explain some of the differences between bare knuckle boxing and boxing. There's a reason why bare knuckle boxing records are separate from boxing, because it is a different sport. And somebody like Mike Perry the rule set works extremely well for him, the style of it. A lot of the main differences between bare knuckle boxing and traditional boxing involve, not having the gloves, which changes the way that you defend strikes. It changes the way that you throw, because you have to, clench your fist. Like Mike Perry was talking on Joe Rogan about how you have to clench your fist whenever, you're throwing punches. And while I think that Jake Paul has the speed advantage in this fight, I do think that Mike Perry is going to have a power advantage. And I think the reason why is because he's so used to fighting with no gloves, that I think the fact that he's always like exploding on his punches, I think that is going to work really well for him. So yeah, some of the differences between bare knuckle boxing and traditional boxing, a lot of it involves the gloves. You can't really block punches the same way. You can still block, it's just a different type of block. You can't rely on the glove itself to block your punches. You have to actually use like your arm, your hand, and sometimes that still does damage to you. If you get hit in the hand really, really hard and you break your hand, that happens. It happens more so probably with kicks, but it happens with punches too, and especially with no gloves. The punches sometimes can hit harder, so there are more cuts in bare knuckle boxing, because without the gloves, obviously the skin breaks open easier, and you're going to see cuts faster. So a lot of times you're going to see first round finishes, second round finishes. You do see a lot of fights go to decision too. You see a lot of wars. You see 5-round wars in bare knuckle boxing, but I would say for the most part it's easier to get finishes because of that aspect, because of the cuts. So it's actually kind of a good thing too, in a way, because then you're taking less head trauma, because it doesn't take as much volume in bare knuckle boxing to do damage as it does in traditional boxing. One thing about bare knuckle boxing too is they have the clinch rule, so you can clinch with one arm. As long as you have one hand free to punch, you can clinch. And you just have to be actively throwing from the clinch position. So that is one big difference between bare knuckle boxing and traditional boxing, is the clinch rule. I've noticed that a lot of MMA fighters do really well in bare knuckle boxing because of that clinch rule. Kevin Croom is an example. His fight with Tony Soto was a great fight. That was an awesome fight. Tony Soto clearly won the fight, but he utilized a lot of that technique with the clinch, and it seemed to kind of play into his style. And there's several fighters that I've noticed use that technique, and it seems like a lot of the MMA fighters do. That's another thing too with the clinch. So when Mike Perry fought MVP, which I would say is probably the most similar of anyone that Jake has fought to Jake Paul, just the way that they fight, because if you notice, Jake Paul does kind of bounce in and out, and that's something that MVP does. He has, more of a karate-based style. So I was trying to kind of find somebody that's, the closest to Jake Paul that I could think of. And that one is probably the closest, I would say, is MVP, just because of the way, like I said, he bounces in and out. So that fight ended up going into like overtime or whatever, basically, because it was a draw originally. And then Mike Perry won. MVP used a lot of the clinch too, which makes sense, like I said, because he's an MMA fighter. And Mike Perry does use it some. Mike Perry has really, really nice body shots. But I think that in bare knuckle boxing and in MMA, it's easier to land body shots actually, because there's no glove. So it's easier to like get in those harder to reach areas, I guess, if you want to call it that, because sometimes it's hard to land accurately because the glove is in the way, depending on how big your gloves are and how big you are. But I think that's an important factor, and I think that Jake Paul probably has a little bit better accuracy with boxing gloves. But I would say without boxing gloves, then I would definitely favor Mike Perry. I still could see Mike Perry getting a finish here. Mike Perry's gonna try to break him down, like body head. I think that if he does that, that will work really effectively. I know he's a bare knuckle boxer, but he's fought boxers before, And his debut in bare knuckle boxing, he fought Julian Lane, and Julian Lane was like the bare knuckle boxing guy at the time. Jake Paul is the favorite in this fight, and I do see why he's the favorite, just because he has more boxing experience. In bare knuckle boxing, like I said, is a completely different sport. So he's also 6'1", so he's got a height advantage on Mike Perry. Mike Perry, I think, is 5'10". I really do have faith in Mike Perry in this fight. I do respect Jake Paul for taking this, though. My question is, how did Mike Perry... I guess Mike Perry isn't... Maybe he's not under contract with BKFC, which that would kind of surprise me, just because of how important he is to their brand. I think Mike Perry is literally the face of BKFC right now. So I'm curious if he's going to go back to BKFC after this, and what kind of a contract he has, or how he was able to compete in boxing and bare knuckle boxing at the same time. Because I think I've seen other people do it, and I know they do like one fight contracts, and they have things like that. But I just, with him being such a big star in BKFC, was kind of surprised that they allowed it. But that's great. Or maybe because he's such a big star, he has more leverage, I guess you could call it. Now, if Jake Paul loses this fight, depending on like if he gets knocked out, does he still fight Mike Tyson?